What if I told you that some of the most chilling villains in cinematic history, Norman Bates, Leatherface and Buffalo Bill, didn't spring from a screenwriter's dark imagination? What if they all borrowed their worst, most grotesque habits from the same soft-spoken handyman, a man who still helped his neighbours change tractor belts on Sundays? It sounds like fiction, doesn't it? But the truth, as it often is far stranger and infinitely more disturbing. Get ready, because this is the uncensored, unvarnished timeline of how Edward Theodore Gein, a quiet man from Plainfield, Wisconsin, inadvertently became the template for modern horror, turning a lonely farmhouse into a real-life house of unspeakable terrors. Ed Gein was born way back on August 27th, 1906 in La Crosse, Wisconsin. But the real story, the one that sets the stage for everything that followed, truly begins when his family moved to a secluded 160-acre farm in Plainfield, a tiny, isolated community with a population of just 300 and change. This wasn't some idyllic childhood, far from it. His father, George, was a largely absent, abusive alcoholic who eventually died young, leaving Ed, his older brother Henry, and their mother, Augusta, to fend for themselves. But it was Augusta who truly ruled the roost, and her reign was one of fire and brimstone. Augusta Gein was a fanatically religious woman, a fundamentalist who preached relentlessly about the inherent sinfulness of humanity, particularly the wickedness of women and the absolute damnation awaiting anyone who dared to engage in sexual acts. She believed the outside world was a cesspool of evil, a place that would corrupt her sons. She kept Ed and Henry virtually isolated, rarely letting them leave the farm, and constantly read them passages from the Bible, focusing on vivid descriptions of death, divine retribution, and eternal suffering. She'd tell them how sex was Satan's tool, how all women, save for herself, were prostitutes, and how any interaction with the opposite sex would lead straight to hell. Can you imagine growing up under that kind of psychological siege? This upbringing profoundly shaped young Ed. Schoolmates remembered him as the kid who always stared at his shoes, never quite met anyone's eye, and laughed at jokes 5 seconds too late. A nervous, awkward delay. He was the first one to bolt for home the instant the school bell rang, desperate to escape back to the perceived safety, or rather the iron grip, of his mother's farm. By high school, he wasn't just shy, he was practically invisible. Neighbours, seeing him slink around the edges of town, started calling him the Shadow. He had no friends, no social life, just Augusta and the farm. Then came another tragedy. In 1944, a suspicious brushfire broke out on the Gein property. Henry, Ed's older brother, died in that fire. While the official cause was asphyxiation, some locals whispered that Henry had bruises on his head, suggesting something more sinister. Henry had reportedly started to openly question Augusta's control and her influence over Ed, even criticising their mother in front of him. In a strange twist, Ed was the one who led authorities to Henry's body. The whispers eventually faded, but the incident left an even deeper scar on Ed. With his father gone, his brother dead, and his mother's health failing, Ed's entire universe shrank down to 2 rooms. Augusta's bedroom, which became a shrine, and the surrounding 46 acres of dirt that defined his isolated existence. He was utterly alone, save for his mother's increasingly frail presence and her ever-present suffocating ideology. The last anchor to any semblance of normalcy for Ed Gein snapped in December 1945 when his mother, Augusta, finally passed away from a stroke. For a man whose entire life had been dictated, controlled, and defined by this one woman, her death was not just a loss, it was an apocalyptic event. It completely shattered his already fragile psyche. Immediately after her death, Ed boarded up every single room in the farmhouse, except for Augusta's bedroom and the kitchen. He left her clothes on the chair, her Bible on the nightstand, and kept her room meticulously clean, a macabre shrine to her memory. He spent the next nearly 2 years in a profound, almost unimaginable state of isolation. He rarely left the farm, neglecting its upkeep, allowing the place to fall into disrepair. His days were filled with chores, and his nights were spent in Augusta's empty rocking chair, reading pulp adventure novels aloud, as if she were still there, listening. He was adrift, unmoored from the only relationship he'd ever known, stewing in a potent brew of grief, loneliness, and psychological turmoil. He felt a desperate need to keep his mother alive, to maintain her presence in his world. It was during this period in 1947 that something snapped, leading him down an even darker path. He began to wander into local cemeteries. He later claimed he just wanted one more conversation with his mother, a way to reconnect. But what he actually did was far more twisted. He started targeting recently buried, middle-aged women, often those who bore a physical resemblance to Augusta. With a shovel and a canvas sack under the cloak of night, he would exhume their graves, pry open their caskets, and haul the corpses back to his secluded farmhouse. This wasn't just grave robbing, it was the beginning of his new, horrifying hobby, taxidermy, but with a human twist. He was trying to literally bring pieces of his mother or women like her back to life, to keep them with him, transforming the dead into grotesque objects of his obsession. Over the next 8 years, Ed Gein systematically raided at least 9 graves, always choosing middle-aged women he believed resembled his deceased mother. His routine was chillingly methodical. He'd wait for a new moon, when the darkness was absolute, ensuring no prying eyes would witness his macabre errands. He'd park his Ford sedan behind the tool shed, then, with a lantern casting eerie shadows, tiptoe between the tombstones, shovel in hand, a canvas sack ready for its gruesome cargo. Back in the decaying farmhouse, the real horror began. Gein would skin the bodies, treating the flesh as if it were an animal hide. He tanned these human skins with salt and battery acid, turning them into pliable material for his ghastly creations. And what creations they were! His home, already a monument to neglect and isolation, became a workshop of the macabre. He crafted keepsakes, each more disturbing than the last. A belt fashioned from human nipples, a drum stretched taut with a human torso, and curtains fringed with human fingers. The full extent of his depravity was truly shocking. Investigators would later confirm his confessions by exhuming test graves in the Plainfield cemetery, finding them empty, exactly as Gein had described. He even made skull caps and bowls from human skulls. There were masks fashioned from human faces and chairs upholstered with human skin, which, as you can imagine, looked like cracked, dried leather. Most disturbingly, he painstakingly stitched together a woman's suit from preserved female skin, including a vest made from skin and organs. His chilling motive: he intended to wear it, literally crawl into her skin, as a way to become his mother. When asked about these unspeakable acts, Gein, with a chilling lack of emotion, simply claimed the work felt like canning vegetables, just another fall harvest. It was a mundane, almost agricultural perspective on the ultimate desecration. For years, Ed Gein's horrifying activities were confined to the graveyard and the privacy of his isolated farm, but eventually his disturbed psyche escalated beyond the desecration of the dead. In 1954, the peaceful routine of Plainfield was shattered when Mary Hogan, the outspoken owner of a local tavern, mysteriously vanished. The scene she left behind was unsettling: a blood smear on the floor, an overturned chair, and no sign of Mary. Locals, accustomed to the quiet rhythms of small-town life, quickly blamed drifters, a common scapegoat for unexplained disappearances. The sheriff, perhaps overwhelmed or simply lacking any solid leads, filed a missing person report and sadly moved on. But Mary Hogan wasn't just missing, she was dead, and her killer was none other than Ed Gein. Her head, separated from her body, eventually joined Gein's macabre collection, becoming a trophy on a shelf in his house. Her skin, like that of the grave-robbed corpses, was meticulously prepared and transformed into a lampshade, adding another gruesome detail to his house of horrors. What's perhaps even more unsettling is the psychological aspect of this murder. Gein, in his twisted loneliness, reportedly practiced speaking in Mary Hogan's voice to the mirror, attempting to mimic her, to internalize her. It was a chilling manifestation of his desire to inhabit the identities of the women he'd claimed. For 3 long years, Ed Gein got away with it, living a quiet, unassuming life while the dark secrets of his farmhouse festered, growing more horrific with each passing day. The facade of normalcy that Ed Gein had so chillingly maintained finally began to crumble on November 16th, 1957. On that fateful day, Bernice Warden, a kind, middle-aged woman who owned a local hardware store in Plainfield, opened her shop for business. A customer walked in, asking to see a rifle. Bernice, ever helpful, took a .22 caliber rifle off the rack for him. That customer was Ed Gein, but he wasn't there for a purchase. He'd initially asked for some window trimmer nails, a mundane request designed to lower her guard. Then, without warning, he shot her with the very rifle she had just handed him. After the shot, Gein swiftly dragged Bernice's body to his pickup truck, which he'd cleverly parked out of sight, and sped back to his isolated farm. He managed to do all of this before the local church let out, ensuring minimal witnesses. The community was quiet, going about their Sunday routines, completely unaware of the horror unfolding. Later that day, Bernice Warden's son, Frank Warden, who also happened to be a deputy sheriff, returned home from a deer hunting trip. He went to check on his mother at the hardware store, only to find the cash register open, money missing, and bloodstains on the floor. His heart must have sunk. One look at the last sales receipt, still sitting on the counter, told him everything he needed to know. The buyer's name was clearly written, Ed Gein. That simple handwritten name, a familiar one in their small town, suddenly became a terrifying clue, pointing directly to the man who would soon become infamous across the nation. The quiet handyman had finally been connected to a brutal crime, and Plainfield was about to discover its darkest secret. Deputy Frank Warden, along with Sheriff Archley and other officers, wasted no time. Following the tyre tracks leading away from the hardware store, they made their way to Ed Gein's secluded farm. What they encountered there would haunt them and the world for decades to come. As they kicked open the front door of the decrepit farmhouse, the officers stopped dead in their tracks, confronted by a scene of unimaginable horror that defied all comprehension. The air inside was thick with the stench of decay, rancid fat, and a desperate, futile attempt to mask it all with pine sol. This wasn't just a messy house, it was a charnel house, a museum of the macabre. A necklace of human tongues dangled grotesquely from a bedpost. Skulls had been inverted and fashioned into cereal bowls, some with their tops crudely sawed off. A chair was upholstered with human skin, the cracked leather-like surface a chilling testament to its origin. Lampshades horrifyingly bore the unmistakable grain of tattooed human dermis. The officers moved through the house, each step revealing a new, more sickening detail. Boxes were filled with various human body parts, nipples, noses, and genitalia, all meticulously preserved. There were masks crafted from the skin of female faces, and the infamous woman suet made from preserved female skin and organs, which Gein confessed he intended to wear. And then the ultimate discovery, the severed heads of Bernice Warden and Mary Hogan, the 2 women Gein had murdered, found chillingly displayed within the house. The sheer scale of the horror was overwhelming. In the woodshed, the officers made the most gruesome discovery of all. Bernice Warden's body, gutted and decapitated, her ankles cruelly roped to a crossbeam, hanging upside down like a slaughtered deer. Amidst this unspeakable chaos, one detail stood out in stark, unsettling contrast. Augusta's bedroom. It was the only tidy space in the entire house, dusted daily, candlelit, and completely untouched, a pristine shrine in the midst of a slaughterhouse. The psychological impact on the investigators was immediate and profound. Officer Dan Chase, overwhelmed by the stench and the sight, leaned over and vomited into a box of human noses. Photographer Ray Kirsch, tasked with documenting the atrocities, later admitted that after shooting the crime scene roll, he went home and drank until the horrifying images blurred, desperately trying to erase what he had witnessed. The Plainfield farmhouse had truly become a house of hell, After the unimaginable horrors discovered in his farmhouse, Ed Gein was immediately taken into custody. The interrogation that followed was an intense, grueling 8-hour ordeal, yet throughout it all, Gein spoke in a detached, almost childlike monotone, his voice devoid of emotion, as if recounting a mundane shopping list rather than a litany of unspeakable crimes. He readily admitted to shooting Bernice Warden, detailing how he'd lured her with the pretense of buying nails before taking her life. He confessed to the extensive grave robbing, explaining how he'd targeted specific women from the local cemetery. And, perhaps most chillingly, he admitted to sewing the full woman suit, describing his macabre project without a hint of remorse or self-awareness. However, there was one crucial detail he emphatically denied: any sexual contact with the bodies. They smelled too bad, he reportedly stated, a detail that provided a disturbing insight into his motivations. His crimes weren't driven by sexual perversion in the traditional sense, but by a profoundly disturbed psychological obsession. When pressed to explain why he did it, why he committed such monstrous acts, Gein offered a chillingly simple, yet profoundly complex answer. He merely shrugged and said, "I wanted to crawl into my mother's skin and be her." This statement, whispered by a man who had literally tried to wear the skin of other women, perfectly encapsulated the depths of his pathology. It wasn't about lust or sadism, it was about an all-consuming, psychotic desire to embody his deceased mother, to somehow resurrect her presence and become one with her. As the tape recorder clicked off, documenting his confession, the hardened detectives in the room could only stare at the ceiling, trying to process the sheer, unprecedented horror of what they had just heard. The case of Ed Gein was unlike anything they, or indeed the world, had ever encountered. Following his shocking confession, Ed Gein's legal journey was as convoluted as his crimes were grotesque. In 1958, he was initially declared mentally unfit to stand trial. Diagnosed with schizophrenia, a severe mental disorder characterized by thought disturbances, delusions, and hallucinations, the court found him incapable of understanding the charges against him or assisting in his own defense. Consequently, he was committed to Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane, where he spent nearly a decade. The Plainfield community, still reeling from the discovery of his house of horrors, waited. Then, in 1968, after years of institutionalization and psychiatric evaluation, Gein was deemed competent enough to face trial. Prosecutors retried him specifically for the murder of Bernice Warden. The trial itself was brief, given the overwhelming evidence and his previous confession. The jury deliberated for a mere 55 minutes before returning their verdict. Guilty, but with the critical caveat of not guilty by reason of insanity. This meant that while he had committed the act, his severe mental illness prevented him from being held criminally responsible in the traditional sense. Gein was then returned to psychiatric care, spending the remainder of his life at Mendota Mental Health Institute. Here, he became a model patient, a stark and unsettling contrast to the monster he was known to be. He was described by staff as polite, soft-spoken and cooperative. He'd participate in hospital activities, winning checkers tournaments and whittling little wooden toys for visiting children and grandchildren of the staff. The very people who cared for him knew his history, yet they often referred to him as the harmless grandpa, a testament to the profound disconnect between the quiet man they saw daily and the unimaginable atrocities he had committed. It was a chilling reminder of the complexity of mental illness and the often deceptive nature of outward appearances. Ed Gein's long, strange and horrifying life finally came to an end on July 26, 1984. He was 77 years old. The cause of death was respiratory failure, complicated by lung cancer, a quiet end for a man whose life had been anything but. He had spent 27 years incarcerated in mental institutions, a stark and isolated existence that mirrored the one he had lived before his crimes were exposed. His burial was a sombre affair, attended by very few. The people of Plainfield, still scarred by the memories and the infamy he brought to their quiet town, wanted nothing more than to bury the memory of the man along with his body. They yearned for the earth to finally close over the horrors he represented. Even after his death, the legend of Ed Gein lingered. Plainfield teenagers, perhaps fueled by local folklore and the enduring creepiness of the abandoned Gein property, later swore they heard shovels in the night, whispers of grave robbers seeking to disturb his final resting place, but as far as anyone knows, no body was ever disturbed again. Ed Gein finally found his permanent resting place, his story etched forever into the dark annals of true crime. The grotesque saga of Ed Gein, a man whose real-life horrors outstripped the darkest fiction, quickly seeped into the cultural consciousness, forever changing the landscape of the horror genre. Hollywood, always quick to seize upon compelling, terrifying narratives, pounced. Perhaps the most famous inspiration came from Alfred Hitchcock's seminal 1960 film, Psycho. Hitchcock masterfully lifted Gein's chilling mommy fixation, the obsessive, suffocating bond with his deceased mother, to create the iconic character of Norman Bates, a disturbed taxidermist who keeps his mother's corpse in the house and assumes her persona. Then, in 1974, Tobe Hooper's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre unleashed Leatherface upon the world. The film borrowed heavily from Gein's macabre practices, featuring a skin-wearing, chainsaw-wielding killer who lived in a desolate farmhouse filled with human remains and furniture made from bones. The sheer brutality and the desolate, isolated setting were direct echoes of Gein's reality, and later Thomas Harris, in his chilling novel The Silence of the Lambs, stitched together the character of Buffalo Bill, a serial killer who skins his female victims to create a woman suit, a direct, horrifying nod to Gein's own gruesome ambition. 3 iconic, terrifying killers, each a unique nightmare, yet all originating from the same quiet Wisconsin ghoul. Even today, the shadow of Ed Gein looms large. Merchandisers, with a morbid fascination, sell t-shirts emblazoned with phrases like Plainfield's pick of the crop. But for the actual villagers of Plainfield, those who lived through the nightmare, the joke dried up decades ago. They roll their eyes, weary of the sensationalism, wishing the world would remember the victims, not just the monster. For them, the memory isn't a thrilling horror story, it's a painful, indelible scar on their community's history. So next time you're streaming a slasher film or a psychological thriller and you find yourself thinking, come on, nobody's that twisted, pause for a moment. Remember the quiet farm at the dead end of an unpaved road in Plainfield, Wisconsin. Remember Ed Gein, the soft-spoken handyman, where reality didn't just imitate fiction, it outran it, leaving a trail of unimaginable horror in its wake. If today's deep dive into the chilling story of Ed Gein left you with goosebumps and a new appreciation for the darkness lurking beneath the surface of everyday life, then you know what to do. Tap that subscribe button for more true crime deep dives. Drop your thoughts and theories below. What do you think truly drove him? And share this video with that friend who always claims horror movies are unrealistic. Trust me, after this, they might just change their mind.